In late August of 1845, a farmer in County Mayo, Ireland, walks his potato field, the way he has walked it every August of his life. The leaves are green, the crop looks good. He goes to bed. He wakes up to a smell. The field he walked the evening before is now black, collapsed and rotting in the ground. Not damaged, not stunted, but dissolving, turning to a foul-smelling slurry overnight. He is not imagining it. Farmers across the country are waking up to the same smell, the same black leaves, the same field that was fine yesterday and is dead today. Within 2 years, roughly 1 million people in Ireland will be dead. Roughly 1 million more will leave the country, many of them never to return. Almost all of it will trace back to a single crop, one that no one in that field had ever seen fail like this before. Here is the strange part. That crop was not native to Ireland. It was not native to Europe at all. 8,000 years earlier, it had been domesticated by farmers in the high mountains of a completely different continent, bred for a climate of frost and thin air, thousands of miles and an ocean away from a Mayo hillside. Picture the distance involved. A plant first selected by farmers working at 11,000 feet above sea level, in a landscape with a third less oxygen than the air Irish lungs were used to, somehow became so central to survival on a damp Atlantic island that a single season of crop failure could empty entire townlands. Nothing about that journey from an Andean lakeshore to an Irish tenant farm was inevitable. Every step of it was a choice someone made, for a reason that made sense to them at the time. The question is not just what killed 1 million people in one country in the 1840s, the question is how a root vegetable grown first by mountain farmers who never saw a European in their lives ended up so central to Ireland's survival that its failure could kill that many people in one country, and how the world's dependence on that same plant is arguably even more concentrated today than it was then. To answer that, we have to go back roughly 8,000 years to a lake 11,000 feet above sea level. Lake Titicaca sits on the border of modern Peru and Bolivia, high enough that the air holds a third less oxygen than at sea level. Nights there can drop below freezing even during the growing season. Almost nothing survives that kind of swing between a hot midday sun and a freezing night. Except it turns out one plant, wild potato species, had grown in these mountains for millions of years before any human ever ate one. Around 8,000 BCE, give or take, farmers in this region began selecting and replanting the least bitter, least toxic wild tubers, because wild potatoes left alone are loaded with natural toxins that make them barely edible. Domestication was not a single discovery. It was generations of farmers quietly choosing which tubers to replant and which to discard, for thousands of years, until the plant itself changed. By the time the Inca Empire rose to power in the 1400s, Andean farmers were not growing one kind of potato. They were growing thousands, different valleys, different altitudes, and different microclimates. Each favored different varieties, and Andean farmers kept them all, not out of sentiment, but as a survival strategy. A frost that wiped out one variety at 10,000 feet might leave a hardier variety at 12,000 feet untouched. Genetic diversity was not a nice-to-have. It was insurance against a landscape that could kill a single crop overnight. Modern researchers cataloging Andean varieties have documented several thousand distinct native potato types still grown in the region today. A scale of diversity almost nothing else in world agriculture can match. And Andean farmers developed something even more valuable than diversity alone, a way to make the potato last for years, not months. The process is called chuño. Farmers spread potatoes out on the ground at high altitude, letting them freeze solid overnight in the thin mountain air, then thaw and get trampled underfoot during the day, squeezing out the water. Repeated over several days, this freeze-dried the tubers into a hard, lightweight product that could be stored for years and rehydrated when needed. Archaeologists have recovered chuño specimens dating to Inca times, and researchers who study the technique believe it was likely discovered generations before the empire itself rose to power. In effect, an ancient version of freeze-drying, engineered with no refrigeration, no chemistry, and no writing system, using nothing but altitude, cold, and repetition. This is worth sitting with, because it inverts almost everything the rest of this story is about to do to the potato. In the Andes, the potato survived by staying diverse, thousands of varieties, none of them dominant, each one a hedge against the failure of the others. What happens next across the ocean is the opposite. One plant, forced into monoculture, staked on a handful of varieties, or sometimes just one. That reversal is where the trouble starts. Spanish conquistadors reached the Andes in the 1530s looking for gold and silver. They found both. They also found potatoes, though almost no one back home cared at first. By the 1570s, Spanish ships were carrying potatoes back across the Atlantic, mostly as a curiosity and a cheap provision for sailors. From Spain, the plant spread slowly into Italy, then reached England and Ireland by the 1590s, well before it took hold in Germanic territories. Adoption was neither fast nor uniform. Italian and Spanish farmers, more familiar with tuber and root crops generally, took to the potato earlier than farmers further north, where grain had dominated the diet for far longer. And here is the part that a plant this useful would not predict. For roughly 2 centuries, most of Europe wanted almost nothing to do with it. The suspicion ran deep, and it had specific, traceable roots. The potato belongs to the nightshade family, along with deadly nightshade itself, a genuinely poisonous plant Europeans already feared. Unlike wheat or barley, the potato grows underground, out of sight, sprouting not from a visible seed but from a buried, knobby tuber, which struck many Europeans as unnatural, even sinister. And the tubers themselves, gnarled and lumpy, reminded some observers of the disfigured limbs associated with leprosy, feeding a belief, false but persistent, that eating potatoes could cause the disease. Popular history often credits Sir Walter Raleigh or Sir Francis Drake with introducing the potato to England. Neither story holds up. The real arrival was ordinary trade from Spain, with no single hero required. In France, the suspicion became law. In 1748, the French Parliament formally banned the cultivation of potatoes for human food on the grounds that they were unsafe. For decades, the crop that Andean farmers had trusted enough to build an empire's food system around was in France, illegal to eat and fed to pigs instead. 2 very different states would eventually break that resistance, not through persuasion alone, but through the machinery of government itself. That is where this story goes next. Prussia forced it. Frederick the Great's kingdom had endured a catastrophic famine and plague in the early 1700s, and grain remained unreliable, vulnerable to weather, to war, to the same failures every time. The potato could grow in poor soil on a fraction of the land grain needed for the same calories, and it sat hidden underground where an invading army could march right over it, without knowing dinner was 6 inches below their boots. Frederick's first order, in 1746, distributing seed potatoes to famine-stricken Pomerania, mostly failed. Peasants who had never grown or eaten the crop rejected it outright. One town's reply survives in the record. The things had neither smell nor taste, they wrote back, and not even the dogs would eat them. Frederick did not stop. Over the following decades, he issued at least 15 separate decrees. The most significant on March 24, 1756, ordering farmers across Prussian territory to plant potatoes on any available land, with officials and pastors assigned to enforce it. This was not a suggestion. It was a state mandate, treated as seriously as grain reserves or army logistics. Frederick would be remembered as Prussia's potato king. Visitors still leave potatoes on his grave in Potsdam. France sold it through status, and then through hunger. Antoine-Augustin Parmentier, a French army pharmacist, spent 3 years as a Prussian prisoner of war, fed almost nothing but potatoes, and came home healthy and convinced the crop France had banned in 1748 was not merely safe, but a serious answer to famine. He spent years working every lever available, a scientific prize, medical lobbying, getting the ban lifted in 1772, and none of it moved French public opinion. So he turned to theater. According to a story repeated for over 2 centuries, likely part legend but consistent with his character, Parmentier planted a field outside Paris in 1781, posted armed guards on it by day, and quietly withdrew them at night, so that curious locals would steal what looked valuable and plant it in their own gardens. He also presented Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette with potato blossoms, which the king reportedly wore in his lapel as a public endorsement. Here is the gap worth naming. Parmentier expected dinners and flowers to win over France. What actually changed French minds was a run of bad grain harvests in 1785 that left the scorned potato standing between parts of the country and real famine. Necessity did what marketing could not finish. Russia imposed it and got riots in return. Faced with recurring grain shortages, the Russian state ordered peasants, including serfs on crown land, to plant potatoes on their best soil under threat of punishment. Peasants did not respond with quiet theft, the way Parmentier's Parisians had. They responded with open revolt. Riots broke out in 1834, then far more widely between 1840 and 1844, drawing in more than 500,000 peasants across the Ural and Volga regions. Crowds beat local officials. In one town, villagers tried to drown a district administrator and his clerks in a river. Troops put the unrest down by force. The state won anyway. Mandatory cultivation continued, and the potato eventually earned the nickname second bread. 3 governments, 3 different methods, one identical goal: make an unwilling population eat a plant it did not trust. By the early 1800s, Europe's relationship with the potato had permanently shifted from suspicion to dependence. Nobody forced, sold, or bribed anyone into planting a second variety alongside it. That dependence, resting on fewer and fewer varieties the further it spread, was about to be tested somewhere it had never been tested before. The potato arrived in Ireland later than in most of Europe, likely by the early 1600s, and found conditions almost eerily well suited to it. Cool, wet, and blessed with soil the crop tolerated better than grain did. But what made the potato take over Irish agriculture was not the soil. It was the same colonial land system this channel has traced in other commodities before. Under British rule, a large share of Irish farmland was owned by English and Anglo-Irish landlords, worked by Irish tenant farmers who typically held only small plots, often just an acre or 2, on which they had to grow enough food to feed a family for a full year. Wheat and other grains required more land per calorie than the average tenant could spare. Much of that land, and much of the farmer's labor, was needed to grow crops destined for export or for rent payment, not for the family's own table. The potato, extraordinarily calorie-dense per acre, was one of the only crops that let a family survive on the scraps of land the system left them. By the early 1800s, potatoes had become the primary food for roughly 1/3 of Ireland's population, and for the rural poor specifically, very often the only food eaten at nearly every meal, in quantities that could reach 10 or more pounds a day per adult. This is the detail worth sitting with, because it explains the disaster that follows. It was not a national love of potatoes that created this dependence. It was a land system that left millions of people almost no other option. The specific arrangement binding most of these families to the land was known as conacre, a short-term rental system in which a landless laborer paid for the use of a small plot, often less than an acre, not in cash but in labor owed to the landlord. Frequently on land the laborer's own family had farmed for generations before losing formal title to it. Rents were set high enough that tenants routinely had almost nothing left over after paying them, and eviction for non-payment was swift, and under existing law, almost entirely at the landlord's discretion. A family surviving on conacre land had no meaningful cushion, no diversified income, and critically, once the blight arrived, no alternative food source. Once the one crop that fit on their allotted acre failed, and Irish farmers had, mostly without meaning to, made that dependence far more fragile than it needed to be. A single variety, the Irish lumper, dominated the poorest farms, chosen for its high yield rather than its genetic resilience. Unlike the thousands of varieties Andean farmers had deliberately maintained as insurance against exactly this kind of risk, Ireland had narrowed its food supply down to one crop, grown in one dominant variety across a huge share of the country's farmland. In September 1845, a fungus-like organism called Phytophthora infestans, potato blight, arrived in Ireland, likely carried on ships from North America. It spreads fast, turns healthy plants to black rot within days, and by late 1845 had destroyed roughly half the Irish potato crop. The following year was worse. The blight was the trigger. It was not, on its own, the reason 1 million people died. Ireland, even at the height of the famine, continued to produce and export other food: grain, butter, livestock, much of it shipped out of the country, under the same market and property arrangements that had created the dependence on potatoes in the first place. The British government's response leaned heavily on laissez-faire economic principles, limited direct relief, public works programs that often demanded labor from people already starving, and a reluctance to interfere with markets or landlords, even as evictions continued and food kept leaving Irish ports. Historians differ sharply on how much of the death toll to attribute to the blight itself versus these policy choices layered on top of it. But there is broad agreement that the disaster was, in the historian's phrase, made in the meeting between an ecological accident and a political system that turned it into a catastrophe. Picture the scene playing out at ports across the west of Ireland through the late 1840s families, who could scrape together the fare, often by selling the last of what little they owned, boarded overcrowded sailing ships bound for Liverpool, Boston, or New York, vessels so poorly provisioned and disease-ridden that they earned the grim nickname coffin ships. Mortality on some crossings reached into the double digits as a percentage of passengers, from typhus, dysentery, and malnutrition contracted before they ever left Irish soil. Those who survived the crossing arrived in cities that were, in many cases, entirely unprepared for the scale of arrivals. Irish immigrants would go on to reshape the political and religious makeup of American cities for generations. But that reshaping began, for most of them, in the hold of a ship they had boarded out of desperation, not opportunity. By the time the worst of it passed in the early 1850s, roughly 1 million people in Ireland were dead, and roughly 1 million more had emigrated, many to the United States, permanently altering the population and politics of both countries. Some regions of Ireland would not recover their pre-famine population for well over a century. Not every response to the famine came from the system that had helped cause it. In March 1847, at the height of what Irish history remembers as Black 47, a group of Choctaw leaders in Oklahoma gathered to raise relief money for a country most of them had never heard of a decade earlier. The Choctaw Nation was itself only 16 years removed from its own forced removal along the Trail of Tears, a journey that had killed a significant share of its people. They raised $170, a modest sum on paper worth several $1,000s today, and sent it to Irish famine relief committees. The gesture was small in dollar terms and large in almost every other sense, one displaced, impoverished nation choosing to help another for no reason beyond recognizing the same kind of suffering in strangers an ocean away. The Choctaw Nation and Ireland still formally commemorate the gift today, nearly 2 centuries later, a rare thread of solidarity running through a story otherwise dominated by policy failures and market indifference. The lesson the rest of the world drew from Ireland in the decades that followed was oddly narrow. Agricultural planners worried about the specific blight and about Ireland's specific poverty. Almost no one drew the broader lesson the Andes had already learned 8,000 years earlier, that leaning an entire food supply on one crop in one dominant variety is a bet against time. That lesson would need to be relearned more than once in the century that followed, including, as this film gets to later, in a variety of potato most of the world eats today. While Ireland's dependence on the potato was turning into catastrophe, a very different kind of dependence was quietly reshaping the rest of industrializing Europe, and it would prove just as consequential in a completely different direction. Britain's factory cities, swelling with workers pulled off the land by the Industrial Revolution, needed cheap, dense calories to keep a growing urban workforce fed on wages that left little room for anything else. Grain-based bread remained the backbone of the working-class diet, as this channel has covered elsewhere, but the potato, cheap and calorie-rich, became the crucial supplement that helped stretch a factory wage further than it could otherwise go. Economic historians have pointed to the potato's spread as one contributing factor behind Europe's rapid population growth in the 18th and 19th centuries, alongside improvements in medicine, sanitation, and agriculture generally. More reliable calories, spread across more of the population, at a lower cost per acre than grain alone, could offer governments kept leaning on the crop through the crises of the 20th century, and not only during the Second World War. During the First World War, wartime blockades and grain shortages across Europe pushed several governments to promote potato cultivation as a hedge against bread shortages, a pattern that would repeat itself more famously a generation later. Britain's Dig for Victory campaign, launched shortly after the outbreak of the Second World War, urged citizens to turn gardens, parks, and even the lawns of grand estates into vegetable plots, with the potato consistently promoted as one of the easiest, most calorie-dense crops an untrained home gardener could grow. A pattern this channel has already traced with a different crop, in a different country, during the same era. That transformation had its roots decades earlier, in a Massachusetts farm boy trying to solve a problem the Irish famine had made urgent for plant breeders everywhere. In 1872, a young horticulturist named Luther Burbank was working with an unusual seed ball that had formed on an early rose potato plant, something potatoes, which normally reproduce from tubers rather than true seed, only rarely produce. Burbank planted 23 seedlings from it, and found one that dramatically outperformed the rest in yield and size. His explicit motivation, by his own account and his biographers, was disease resistance. Decades after the Irish famine, plant breeders across Europe and America were racing to develop potato varieties less vulnerable to the blight that had devastated Ireland's lumper crop. Burbank sold the rights to his new variety for $150 in 1875 and used the money to relocate to Santa Rosa, California, where he would go on to develop hundreds of new plant varieties over the following decades. Here is the gap worth noticing. Burbank bred his potato to help solve a 19th century European famine. What actually made his potato historically significant was something else entirely, discovered almost by accident decades later, a naturally occurring mutation of his variety, with a rougher, russet-colored skin, turned out to store exceptionally well and produce an unusually large, uniform tuber traits that meant almost nothing to Irish farmers rebuilding their food supply, and everything to a future industry Burbank could not have imagined. That mutation would eventually be renamed the Russet Burbank, and within a century it would become, by a wide margin, the most planted potato variety in North America. Not because it solved Ireland's blight, but because of a business deal that had nothing to do with Ireland at all. Then came a transformation as significant in its way as anything that happened in an Andean field 8,000 years earlier: industrial standardization. In the American West, Idaho's volcanic soil and irrigated high desert turned out to be nearly perfect for growing a specific variety called the Russet Burbank. large, starchy, with a low water content that happened to be ideal for frying. By the 1940s, an Idaho farmer turned businessman named J.R. Simplot had built the largest fresh potato shipping operation in the country, and during the Second World War was supplying a significant share of the dehydrated potatoes eaten by American troops overseas. After the war, Simplot's company pushed further, developing and patenting one of the first commercially viable frozen French fry processes by the early 1950s. For years, it struggled to find its real market. Home cooks, it turned out, mostly weren't excited about frying frozen potatoes in their own kitchens. Restaurants were a different story. In 1967, Simplot and McDonald's founder Ray Kroc sealed a supply deal with a handshake. McDonald's had been cutting fresh potatoes into fries at every single location, a labor-intensive process made worse by the fact that fresh Russet Burbanks simply were not available for a stretch of every summer, creating exactly the kind of inconsistency a growing fast food chain could not tolerate. Simplot's frozen fries solved both problems at once: consistent product, available year-round at a fraction of the labor cost. By 1972, every French fry served at every McDonald's location in the country was frozen before it ever touched hot oil. The French fry, once a labor-intensive item requiring a trained cook standing at a fryer with a knife, had become one of the most standardized, most profitable items in the entire fast food industry. A single potato variety, grown on a fraction of American farmland, feeding a global restaurant chain. The scale that followed is worth stating plainly. Idaho alone now produces roughly a third of the entire American potato harvest, and within that harvest, the Russet Burbank and its close commercial relatives dominate the acreage devoted to processing potatoes specifically, the varieties destined for a fryer or a chip bag rather than a dinner table. A crop that existed in the Andes as thousands of distinct varieties spread across thousands of distinct microclimates, now exists for a large share of American and global consumption as a small handful of varieties grown across enormous, largely uniform fields, irrigated, fertilized, and monitored with a precision Inca terrace farmers could not have imagined, but genetically far closer to Ireland's fragile lumper monoculture than to the diversified system that first tamed this plant 8,000 years ago. The potato that had once meant thousands of distinct varieties bred for thousands of distinct mountain valleys, now for a huge share of global consumption, increasingly meant one variety, grown at industrial scale, cut into an identical shape, and fried in an identical way on nearly every continent on Earth. Long before the frozen fry, the potato had already found its way into another item, just as central to how the modern world eats it, the potato chip. The famous version of the story says a chef named George Crumb, working at a restaurant in Saratoga Springs in 1853, sliced potatoes paper-thin out of spite after a demanding customer, often identified as Cornelius Vanderbilt, sent his fries back for being too thick. It is a great story, and almost none of it holds up. The first documented mention of Crumb's involvement did not appear until 1885. The Vanderbilt detail was added in 1973 by an advertisement, not a historian, and Vanderbilt was in Europe that summer. Thin fried potato slices already existed in English cookbooks decades before Crumb was born. What actually happened at that restaurant in the 1850s is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that the chip stayed a restaurant-only novelty for decades, then reached grocery shelves in 1895 through an Ohio entrepreneur named William Tappenden, and became a true national brand under Herman Lay in the 1930s. By 1965, Lay's company had merged into PepsiCo, folding the chip into one of the largest food conglomerates on Earth. Today, Americans eat roughly 1.5 billion pounds of potato chips a year, an industry built in large part on a founding story that almost certainly never happened the way it is told, a tale of a spiteful chef beats a snack evolved gradually across several unrecorded cooks every time, and better stories get repeated until they're treated as fact. Underneath both the chip and the fry sits the same vulnerability this film raised in the Andes. Modern potato farming leans on a small handful of varieties, the Russet Burbank prominent among them, grown across enormous, genetically similar fields. Structurally, that is closer to Ireland's lumper monoculture than to the diversity that first tamed this plant 8,000 years ago. The insurance policy still exists, just not where most of the world's potatoes are grown. In Lima, Peru, the International Potato Center maintains a gene bank holding more than 20,000 accessions of potato, sweet potato, and related Andean root crops, stored as living plants, tissue cultures, and cryogenically frozen material, precisely so no single fire, flood, or war can erase it. If a new blight ever does to industrial potato farming what Phytophthora infestans did to Ireland in 1845, that collection is one of the more likely places breeders would turn first. And most of the world's potatoes today are not even grown where this story has spent most of its time. China is now the single largest potato producer on Earth, having adopted the crop in mountainous provinces where rice and wheat could not survive. The same logic that made the potato valuable in the Andes applied on an industrial scale. And in October 1995, potato tissue became the first plant matter grown aboard a space shuttle for food crop research. A NASA and University of Wisconsin experiment aimed at the same problem. Andean farmers solved 8,000 years earlier how to grow enough calories in conditions almost nothing else can survive. Scientists studying crops for a future Mars colony still put the potato near the top of the list. For exactly that reason. Today, a supermarket potato aisle in almost any wealthy country holds russet potatoes, red potatoes, fingerlings, bags of frozen fries, tubes of chips in a dozen flavors, an apparent abundance of choice that mostly traces back to a small handful of commercial varieties, bred for yield, shelf life, and frying performance rather than the resilience Andean farmers once bred for. None of it announces where it came from. No bag of fries mentions that its variety exists because an Idaho farmer needed a potato that could sit in a freezer for months. No bag of chips mentions that its origin story is very likely fiction, manufactured by an advertisement roughly 70 years after the fact. No supermarket shelf anywhere mentions Lake Titicaca or chuño, or the fact that the genetic insurance policy against the next global blight sits in a research facility in Lima that most shoppers have never heard of. This is not a story about one villain. Frederick the Great's decrees genuinely helped prevent future famines in Prussia. Parmentier's stunts, real or embellished, helped introduce a crop that fed millions of French people through repeated bad harvests. Simplot's frozen fries made a labor-intensive food affordable and consistent at a scale that had never existed before. Each of these choices solved a real, specific problem in its own time, for its own reasons. No one across 3 centuries was working toward some coordinated plan. The narrow, fragile monoculture the world now largely depends on is what was left behind after all of those separate, reasonable decisions accumulated on top of each other. Consider for a moment how differently the story reads depending on where you're standing. In the Andes, the same plant means thousands of varieties, still cultivated today by farmers whose ancestors bred it in the first place, each variety suited to one particular slope of one particular mountain. In Ireland, it means a monument, a memorial, and a population that still has not fully recovered a century and a half later. In Idaho, it means a single variety grown across hundreds of thousands of acres, engineered for a fryer rather than a family garden. In a gene bank in Lima, it means a hedge against a catastrophe nobody has had to face yet, but one the historical record suggests is not impossible. None of these versions of the potato is more real than the others. They are simply what happens when the same plant passes through the hands of an Inca terrace farmer, a Prussian king, a French pharmacist, an Irish tenant, an American plant breeder, and a fast food executive, each of them solving a completely different problem with the same root vegetable, none of them coordinating with any of the others, some of them separated from each other by centuries. That is, in the end, the pattern worth carrying out of a story like this and into whatever commodity comes next. The object rarely changes as much as the reasons people need it. Right now, somewhere above 11,000 feet near Lake Titicaca, a farmer is harvesting a variety of potato that has no name in any language you would recognize, grown from tubers whose lineage traces back centuries. Right now, in Idaho, a combine is pulling russet Burbanks out of volcanic soil that will be sliced, frozen, and shipped to a fryer somewhere on nearly every continent on Earth. Right now, in a quiet research facility in Lima, a technician is logging another tuber into a database that exists specifically because the last time the world bet everything on one variety, roughly 1 million people didn't survive it. And right now, in a kitchen somewhere, someone is opening a bag of chips without a single thought about any of it. Because that thoughtlessness, like the bread this channel has already traced, is what generations of uncoordinated decisions quietly leave behind. The potato was never just a side dish. It was famine and its opposite. It was a king's decree and a pharmacist's publicity stunt. It was the thing that let a factory city feed itself, and the thing whose failure emptied a country. It was diversity deliberately maintained for 8,000 years, and it is, right now, a bet that a huge share of the world is making on a genetically narrow handful of varieties, whether anyone eating a plate of fries has ever thought about it or not. It was power buried in the dirt, waiting to be dug up. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want more stories about the objects, systems, and hidden forces that built the modern world, subscribe to the channel. The next story is already waiting. See you in the next video.